Good day, everyone, and thank you for joining. My name is David Merrill. I'm the CTO of Corbinsoft. Corbinsoft is a Siemens channel partner, and today I will be presenting an idea called the DOORS Survival Kit for Polarion. Thank you very much for joining today. We are recording this session, so after the webinar, you will be able to view it online at corbinsoft.com. As a participant, I am going to strongly recommend and ask that you participate via the question and answer panel for questions throughout the presentation. I will stop periodically and address and look at those questions. So if you do ask things as I go, I will do my best to make it an interactive participation. We can also end at the end with an extended question and answer session where we can go into deeper detail of topics that are interesting to you, or you can just simply address more general topics of Polarion that won't be covered in our webinar today. Our agenda is pretty simple. I'm going to address some DOORS challenges, specifically how does a company work with the current DOORS 9, or I should say the legacy DOORS 9 product, where a lot of information is already stored, and how can you get the best of that and pave the way for a future where you can take advantage of more robust application lifecycle management topics, even getting as far into continuous integration and DevOps. I'll follow with a live demonstration of Polarion scenarios, and that will be the bulk of our time today. I don't have a whole lot to show you in terms of PowerPoint slides. Really, I want to be able to tell this story in the backdrop of the Polarion product itself. But I will sort of frame this at first. And the first question is, what about the survival kit for DOORS? Why did I phrase it this way? And maybe in answering this, I'll tell you a little bit about myself and my experience in the field. For example, I have been working with Polarion for over 10 years. I've been involved demonstrating, implementing, and sustaining Polarion with many customers in North America and even globally. So all of the things that I talk about today, I've personally implemented with customers. And so this idea of how to transition from DOORS into something else is an interesting challenge. But we want to be able to show you how a Polarion concept, a feature called Polarion Documents, is a vibrant way to absorb that DOORS module functionality so that you can really take off what you've started in DOORS and extend it beyond just typical requirements management. And so really, I won't focus too much on the idea of replacing DOORS, but rather as a survival kit, I want to provide or show you how you can begin immediately, almost today, if you really wanted to start today, and build on top of what exists in DOORS and continue it in Polarion ALM, where you can really establish some of the, I think, unparalleled end-to-end traceability and strength of workflow enforcement that Polarion has really distinguished itself for. And so with that, let's talk a little bit about why this survival kit is necessary in the first place. If you have if you're an institutional DOORS user, you have hundreds, if not thousands, of projects that are in DOORS and perhaps in current release. And DOORS exists for you as a trusted tool. Well, moving from that amount of data to another tool to handle all of your requirements is a big step. It's a big process, almost strategic, requiring months, if not years, of research and evaluation. I'd like to change that up a little bit because I think we're all here because we understand that the present market for software development requires more functionality than DOORS 9 offers. That means the speed at which these requirements are managed, the frequency at which development iterations cause change, yet the challenge to maintain the best practices within the requirements management and system engineering down through quality assurance and development release. So what's really needed is a low-risk approach to taking a new tool on without abandoning all of the resources that have been built and established within DOORS. One way to address this is with a small footprint for a low-risk approach. And so in talking a little bit about Polarion ALM, we'll see that it's a Web 2.0 application. That means there's no installable clients. And in a matter of minutes, I can have a Polarion server ready for global access as a web-based application. And so stakeholders from all over the globe can access a 24/7 operating server. And it can begin at a very single, slim form factor server and grow into clustered and high availability configurations. So those very large customers using DOORS will have the same level of backbone support that the smaller DOORS user has as well, with a faster, easier way to present that server framework. And so the idea is that with tactical procedures in implementation, starting small and gaining trust in Polarion ALM to extend DOORS will lead into the strategic question of what happens at that right point in the future when DOORS can be essentially end of life or no longer relied upon to generate new information. And if we were talking at a fireside, I would almost stop right now and start telling the story of many of these Polarion customers, because it's far less what David Merrill thinks is the right thing to do here, and much more what these customers have been able to achieve pragmatically with Polarion. And that's sort of the undercurrent of everything that I'm going to be talking about today. All of the topics we see are grounded in very pragmatic approaches to solving challenges that exist in product development. You can see some of these customers are in medical devices. Some of these customers are in automotive and aerospace. And some are dedicated to being software companies, either to produce software like a Red Hat or to facilitate the kind of business applications like a bank or a financial institution where all the applications, both off the shelf and custom developed, have to work together to produce product and services. Their stories are really everything that Polarion is based on today, both from a feature set and from a software intended use or framework configuration. So I'm going to dedicate my time to talking about the software application lifecycle development here. And so if we review, for those of you perhaps who are not terribly familiar with DOORS, what is DOORS 9 exactly? Well, for many years, it was the de facto requirements management tool. It introduced an idea called a DOORS module, which presented a document-like container, if you will, to requirements. And so you could organize all of your requirements rather than in a database presentation, more in a ready-to-view module, they called it, that could ultimately be exported into a Word document or to a PDF. And that is what ultimately would be, is signature reviewed and approved later on. Additionally, it had a very powerful scripting environment called DXL that allowed the DOORS clients to be able to go outside of the basic usage of DOORS. And so what happened is there a lot of deep customization occurred. Some of the problems that happened is through the acquisition stream, the client server application ends up having a very heavy footprint. All of this DXL scripting, all of the business logic of DOORS executed on the client. So a big fat application was necessary. So that means that it was more difficult to use in a global scenario. So as companies scaled outward, this tool became more and more difficult to be used outside of particular office spaces. Well, then along came the next generation of DOORS, which unfortunately missed an upgrade path to go from DOORS 9 to their new concept. And that really opens the door for other tools to function in a much more pragmatic way, to not just be limited to the feature set of DOORS next generation, but rather to expand beyond it. And so inside Polarion, for example, we have OSLC linking that would allow Polarion work items and objects to link directly to DOORS next generation objects. And so whether you have DOORS 9 or DOORS next generation or some combination of the two, we see Polarion as being an important tool to be able to fill those things that aren't being tracked well today. And that's really brings us to the whole feature set of Polarion ALM. It is fundamentally based on the idea of system engineering and requirements management, although it's not limited just to requirements, but rather to all of the ideation possibilities of planning, of gathering the voice of the customer, stakeholder needs, and all of the work that leads up to system requirements. Those are part of the full balance of data and documents that you'll often see inside Polarion. Polarion treats requirements documents as workflow objects. As we'll see, it takes the concept of a DOORS module and expands it to be really a very vibrant container of all the information that's inside of a document, diagrams and unstructured text, as well as the structured requirements and artifacts that later on feed into the rest of product development. It has round-trip capabilities, of course, that lets us exchange this Polarion document with Word, with Microsoft Excel, with something that we'll talk about a little bit called Recif, and introduces product line engineering and variants to deal with all of the challenges of having these hundreds of products without having to copy and replicate document after document. Very important to the idea of application lifecycle management is the quality assurance, to be able to extend to writing and managing test cases, to tracking those executions, whether they're manual execution or automated tests coming from tools like Jenkins or Jira Bamboo or other automated test scenarios, where we can now start to visualize the end-to-end traceability of all of these ideation needs right down to the test results. And we'll see some of that today. The third pillar, I guess you could say, of Polarion ALM is to now organize and develop the work and enforce the process. So this is where we'll see that we can begin with the DOORS requirement module and extend it easily to include direct traceability to Agile user stories and the operations and tasks which actually get the work done. All along the line, we want to make sure that good practices, or GXP, processes are capable of being enforced not just at the module level, not just with a DXL script, but rather as a central part of the Polarion framework. So we'll see document importing, we'll see document editing, the same kinds of tasks that you might typically see with a Word document, all happening inside the context of this Polarion live document workflow object. Ultimately, we want to be able to approve the document inside Polarion if necessary, and allow that document to be a read-only object of evidence of the procedures that have authorized the work that will be done in software development or in overall product development. It's not mandatory, but the capabilities are there when and if is necessary. So we'll see some of that today. We'll be able to import from a series of different sources, including taking customer Word documents or Excel, importing them directly into Polarion, and then immediately start using them. Internal users will be able to collaborate on those documents simultaneously. Gone will be the need to check in and check out and lock information, but rather inline changes are streamed and merged together when they happen. And ultimately that shortens the process of going from structured requirements, for example, to that perfectly reviewed system requirements document that's ready for execution, or that becomes the basis for Agile-based development iterations. So what we'll see today is that all types of Polarion documents are going to be included in our Polarion project. And inside that document, as a full container of work, we'll be able to see these workflow objects that govern the process of, say, not just the system requirement specification as you see here, but how that system requirement then decomposes into a software design, and how that software design requirement might be implemented explicitly by a test. And all of these work together to fill the directions that feed into the ALM process in Polarion, so that the business analyst at the beginning of the chain has as much view and ready traceability to the end of the chain that might be happening with that test analyst who's actually executing the test. And the reverse is also true, that the test analyst and the testers can see the process of the product being built before they simply have to start executing tests. They become collaborators and contributors to the process. Well, how do we get this done for DOORS? One clear way that we have immediately is to use Recif. Now, Recif is part of the round-trip sequence of supported features in Polarion. It lets us import and export transparently with this requirements interchange format. So no configuration of Polarion, no setup is required. I can begin, as we'll see in just a moment, using Recif imports immediately. So this Recif document can come right from DOORS 9. Someone from a DOORS 9 client can produce a single module export, or a module bundle, as I sometimes refer to that, and I can import that data directly into Polarion, make them part of Agile sprints. Those sprints might cause some updates to those documents, and I can in turn export that data through Recif back to DOORS 9. And that can happen immediately. It doesn't take much planning. It just makes sure, we just need to make sure we organize where the data is going in both sides of the equation, as we'll see in a moment. That is one key area where we can begin very much tactically. And then as we go more to the deeper down into the strategic side, as Polarion's use expands in ALM, we'll be able to bring the DOORS connector in place. And the DOORS connector will open the door from file imports and exports, as we saw with Recif, but actually allow us to communicate directly to DOORS from the Polarion server. In this diagram below, you'll see how we facilitate that. A DOORS client is set up to communicate to and from the Polarion server and to DOORS. That client becomes essentially a middleware application and handles the exchange of data between the two systems. We can synchronize projects, certain artifacts, or many projects all at the same time. Then looking forward a little bit more down the line, once the synchronized connection is achieved, in the event that certain projects should be completely exported into Polarion, rather than having to rely on a module by module export function, Polarion can import an entire DOORS project in as an entire Polarion project. And it will use the information from that original DOORS project to create the configurations necessary in Polarion to be able to manage that project going forward. This is much more the migration of data from DOORS into Polarion, but it dramatically reduces the level of work to accomplish that versus some of the other methods. So we see those three ways that Polarion can be part of that DOORS survival kit, because this is something that we've learned from our customers, and that is that product development and release of product and services are not just about the requirements. They're not even just about the tests, because it's a continuum of information that is constantly feeding and getting feedback from the software development lifecycle. If there are high-level product release factors or physical design, that's important. Any regulatory standards we see sometimes in medical areas or life sciences software, they have to conform with FDA standards, but it also could be business process standards. It needs to be able to produce deliverables that can be held inside of a company if necessary. But system requirements and testing and test results all feed into the software development lifecycle. And the message that we receive from our customers is clearly that this is all about Polarion ALM. Okay, I'm going to pause for just a second because we have a question. And I'm pausing in part because I want you to get the sense of as much interaction with me today as possible. So one question says, does Recif transactions between DOORS and Polarion support the transfer of revision or history files? Well, that's a really good point. What I would say is that, and we'll see this in just a moment, when I import the Recif file, it will absolutely create history inside Polarion. And so if I'm going back into the history of DOORS, if I produce Recif exports at key DOORS baselines, then I can replicate those baselines inside Polarion. But if we consider the ongoing use of Polarion, each import and export operation will in fact create a moment of history in DOORS and a moment of history in Polarion. The connector, on the other hand, produces this kind of historical change every time that synchronization event fires. So if it fires in near real time, we'll see the building history from day one forward almost matching up. Thank you very much for that question. And again, we'll see a little bit of this happen right inside Polarion. And that actually will bring us to the time to hand over to the demonstrations. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about what I'm going to show you today so you can understand the process. One is we're going to use Recif to bring in actual DOORS module information. It's sample information, but we'll see that happen. We'll create Polarion documents, and we'll then be able to start using those Polarion documents. And I'll explain a little bit about how the Polarion document container works in Polarion and some of the other Polarion features. The second major part is to go beyond just that document and start to interoperate with that information coming from DOORS. And so while that information was just imported, we'll take those requirements and we'll associate them to a waterfall, maybe an Agile process, but I'll use Agile in this case, where a user story can be created to implement those requirements. And then around that user story, we'll include that into a sprint, and we'll start following the tasks associated to implementing those requirements directly in Polarion. And ultimately, that might result in changes to the requirement per se, or maybe even to the status of that requirement, such that once it's been implemented with a user story, that information of status would return back to DOORS. We'll also talk, if time allows, to have a little bit more of expanding into test management features. While that might be subject for another deeper dive webinar, and we'll talk about where we can set up and build the synchronization information through the DOORS connector. So with that, I'm going to stop this use of PowerPoint and bring in the Polarion Web Console. And so it just so happens that I'm using Windows right now, and it's Chrome on Windows, but the web application is independent of client or browser. So I could be using my Mac, which is just to my left here, a phone, a tablet, a Linux machine. There's really no limitation to the platforms that I can access Polarion with. I would say that most common would be using Microsoft Edge and Firefox and Chrome and Internet Explorer with Polarion, although Safari and other lesser known brands of browsers are equally effective. What we're seeing right now is a Polarion project. It is located on my Polarion server, which is hosted in the Amazon cloud, but it could also be installed in your own corporate network. Even though I'm using just one project, there's really going to be a multiplicity of projects which can work together to develop more complex associations of products and servers. So if I was a large organization and I was building on top of my ERP and CRM systems, and I was managing the customization and configuration of those applications, then I would have equal changes and requirements to those out-of-box tools that I might have if I was creating and building software just on my own. And so one Polarion project does not have to stand alone, but rather it can interact with many different Polarion projects. Over here on the left-hand side is what we call the navigation panel. And this is changeable as by me, the user. I can build a set of favorites to look at, or I can expand and look at key concepts in Polarion, like test runs, looking a little bit forward into our demonstration future. I'm going to choose to show Polarion work items here, because the work items are an important building block of what we're about to start. And here in this project, because it's designed to be an agile implementation of a software product, I have epics and user stories together with requirements. And those will build sort of the principle of system engineering inside this particular space. It's just one type of requirement, but there could be many types of requirements. And each individual Polarion project can have the same or perhaps different enumerations of work items to fit that particular model of how the product is developed. And we'll see some differences of that a little bit later on as well. What I'm going to jump right into is to this right-hand side, the workspace. And if I'm sure that I know today that I want to jump inside building specifications, I would click on the specification space. But maybe I'd like to see a dashboard of how my project is behaving and working well today. And so this gives me a Kanban board of the high-level epics. And maybe one of the things that I would realize is that, okay, we're a little bit behind on this one, so I'm going to pull it back. I'm going to stop the progress of that epic, and maybe even we're going to pull back one more. And so inside this dashboard, I can take activity that adjusts and modifies some of these organization and execution-based work items. And as I move down below, you can see information about the release and about the particular iteration. We'll deal with that a little bit in a few minutes. And some other history and trending information, which if this were an active project, I'd see a lot more resulting activity here. Since it's a demonstration project, I don't have a lot of activity against this one project on a day-to-day basis. So inside a Polarion project, we don't just have documents and we don't just have work items, but we have large activities and dashboarding that help guide us into the pulse, or how well a particular project is proceeding at this moment in time, even to find out, are we on track and how much work is left to be done, and are all of my work items in the correct status to move forward. If I had to press that release button today, would my product be able to release with quality? Or perhaps maybe I'd want to prevent that release from happening in the first part if some of the process has not been ensured along the way. But we're really going to talk about bringing in that DOORS data first. So I just wanted to paint for you the landscape of where that information is coming in, and take it to the next point, which is I have a DOORS recif file, and I want to import it into my specification area. So now in this tab in Polarion, it's the same project. Across my browser, I can have multiple tabs, and then using these tabs, I can interact with all of the documents or some of the documents. Now, one of the things that I want to be able to do right now is to import a recif document. So this is one document that has been prepared from a DOORS client before. So I'll select that recif format here, which I have on my system. And it's one that I've seen before. So I can set up how many of these particular documents I choose to import and manage. I can specify what name they should have. In the interest of time, I'm going to kind of speed through this part of it to the key next point to decide how they map. This is a critical part of being able to use the DOORS, which I might not have ever seen before, inside of an out-of-box Polarion project, because I can map the data from DOORS into the appropriate location of Polarion. Now, earlier today, I saved templates that indicated, how do I want my system requirements imported. I'll select that, and I'll load the template, which will define the mapping between the DOORS information into Polarion for the system engineering document. And I'll come down in the hardware controls. If I had contingencies between software and hardware, then I'd want to be able to also load and configure this data. So as we repeat document imports, I can manage and control that to a high degree. Also, it's important to note that any data coming from DOORS, all of the attributes associated to a particular module can be mapped into a particular field inside Polarion. And it just so happens, again, for ease of demonstration, I'm limiting what fields are being mapped. Okay, and then I'll complete the final one with the software requirements, and we'll pick that template as well. Once I'm satisfied that I have all the information that I need, I'm going to start this import. And this import is running in the background. It's also something that can be set up to run periodically. So if I had periodic exports of Recif data from DOORS, I'd be able to pick up and process many of them at one time. Now, while that's running in the background, I wanted to talk a little bit about what a Polarion document looks like. So this is going to deposit documents in the DOORS folder inside the specification. If we go to the index, we can see that they are building out right now. But let's take a look at a document that's already been built in Polarion. And so it's going to be a good overview to what we're about to see. Immediately, you can see that it follows and is very close to the same type of visual presentation that I expect to see in a Word document. But over here on the left-hand side, I see some particular annotations, some set-asides, if you will, that help me differentiate the information that I'm looking at. So this is probably an example to be able to show where I have unstructured text, and this information doesn't have an icon over here on the left side. This is important to the document, but is not part of a specific requirement. But as I move down below here, you'll see specific work items or artifacts that are in this document that represent database elements. And these are the things that I'll be able to very carefully track and control, and that have very robust attributes that live not just in this document, but in the entire Polarion ecosystem. And so whether they're in a document or not in a document, I'll be able to interact with them in the same way. This is really nice to be able to then export this document directly to PDF, or I could export it into Word, where the information that you see in here in Polarion, it isn't in a Word file, but we'll be able to produce a single file with that information if you want to share and collaborate with users who aren't in Polarion. And with Word Round Trip, they can actually make changes and comment and collaborate on the document and get me back the information from Polarion or into Polarion without having to have me type and rekey any of that information. I'm going to pause for a moment and see if there's any questions. Yeah, so we do have one question. Is it possible to create attributes on the fly inside Polarion when importing the Recif file? That's a good question. With Recif, we're not able to create the custom fields and the layout within Polarion. That needs to be created beforehand. However, when we look at the DOORS project import, it will create the structures and the prototypes that are required from a given DOORS project into Polarion automatically. And that really speaks to a little bit more of the preparation and configuration to be ready for importing and the connector for ongoing synchronization, which is why I think that's sort of a second or a third level approach of the survival kit in DOORS, and Recif is the first. So let's check in. I hope that answered your question. Let's check in with those documents that I imported, and let's start with opening up the system requirements document. So here we see that I have the system requirements, the heading, and the information has been imported. I also have software requirements, and if there are any hardware requirements, here are hardware allocated requirements. These have been coming in directly from DOORS, and we're achieving a history. So I can now start to expand this. Maybe I want to make sure that the title of this is System Requirements. And I'm not limited to what is in here as well. I can begin to author a new requirement, new requirements. And then if I just press Enter and Tab, I'll be able to create a new sub-requirement. So what's beneficial here is the same quick things you might be used to doing when you're authoring a document inside Word carry into the Polarion document, because the document as a whole is a container. And if I wanted to include not just requirement information, this might be the paragraph where I define the purpose and explanation of the tool. That might be important to the reader of the document, but not necessarily necessary for someone who's handling the downstream system engineering. So when I press save, I've now committed this information to Polarion. And not just for this one revision, but rather every single change I've ever made to this document has been achieved here in history. And so this starts to address that question of how do we know what's changed? Well, I can compare the changes between the last two revisions and see what that document looks like. What has been added? In green, we see everything new. In red, we see everything that's been removed. And if we want to compare work items, we'll be able to see not just a document by document comparison, but a view of added, removed, and changed work items. This is an important feature inside Polarion because the three questions, while Polarion answers a lot of questions, it prevents you from ever have to pursue asking questions like who did something, what did they do, and when did they do it. Looking for that information in Polarion is transparent and not something you have to search very hard for. However, we also want to understand how this document would then become and show traceability and downstream activity for extending beyond the requirements. So we're at the system requirements level, and I'm going to change the view of this document from the document view to the tree view. You know, if you are used to viewing DOORS, this is not a dissimilar view, but you can see here that I start to see traceability not just between my document, but if I expand it, I'll be able to see traceability to other downstream work items. And being able to see those work items and deal with those work items might mean that, in fact, here I'll be able to create a test case. And so I'll create a verifying test case to test this new sub-requirement. And as soon as I make changes like that, we'll be able to see those elements show up directly in this traceability. So we want to move very quickly from being able to view to view the element here in a document and then start working on each individual element. But then also I can transparently move back to the document as a whole. So let's talk a little bit more about what can go inside an individual requirement. I only have single lines, but if I hold down the Shift key and I press Enter, I can show just a lot more vibrant information. Perhaps I would want to attach a screenshot. So let me make a quick screenshot here. And I'll put that directly into my requirement. So images are easily set up, and we can reduce the size of that. We can also add tables. And these tables could be important to the actual requirement, or they could also be information that shows up in the unstructured part of the document. I also, if I come up here to the right-hand side, if I click on this menu option, you can see that I can create diagrams, mathematical formulas, table of contents, and important cross-references. But let me at least go in and just very briefly cover the diagram tool, which is available to not have to use Visio, but rather to be able to step in and create UML objects as necessary that become part of the requirement itself. So now I'm adding that metadata and visualization directly into this requirement. Each change that I did become part of that change history. The other thing that I can do is open up that whole item and see all of the robust information available to it. So over here on the left-hand side, I'm going to click on this and open that one requirement. And now I have much more of a database form entry of that requirement in all of its detail. I see the visual traceability of this high-level item to all of its lower-level constituents. I also see the description field that we edited inside Polarion. And then we have a wide array of both default and easily added custom fields to expand and trap the kinds of requirements and attributes that were part of the question earlier. Let me pause for a moment and address some questions. So one question is, can the Polarion document incorporate OLE images? Yeah, so when we import from DOORS and from Recif, we'll definitely be able to take Polarion, or take the Recif OLE images and bring them into Polarion as viable attachments to the document with previews, as well as attachments to the work item as a whole. And so that particular document didn't have one, but if I choose to incorporate those documents as attachments, I'll be able to say, for example, let's attach my PowerPoint slide here today into this particular work item. And as I do this, I'm now making this not merely an inclusion in the requirement, but rather a version controlled source of what goes into this particular requirement. I'll be able to track the changes of the repeating versions of those external files directly in here as well. And if I need to insert a preview or take part of the screen of that and insert that into the document or description, that's absolutely possible. Very good question. Okay, well, sometimes this is too much for an early user of Polarion, or maybe even someone who's used to really focusing on a Word document. And so maybe these changes I'd like to do directly inside the document as a whole. So I can expand and show work item properties, which will allow me to make these kinds of changes directly to the system that I make on that other form. So I can control the look and feel of this document quite nicely. Well, let's start talking about the second scenario. Now that we've imported some of these requirements, let's look at software requirements. And I'm going to add a new software requirement. Let me write this correctly. So I'm going to author a brand new software requirement. And I want to see what it takes now to take that requirement and the one before that was part of the DOORS. I'm going to take the older and the newer, and I'm going to make that part of what I implement as a user story. So in order to do that, I'd like to open up my view here and start talking a little bit, not about requirements, but these user stories. And maybe I'll start by saying I'd like to look at a list of user stories that are part of my unplanned backlog. So just before, you can see that I've created a user story that, as a webinar participant, I want to see DOORS requirements implemented as a Polarion Scrum. And so inside this view, I have that user story. And I'm going to start an important linking dialog that will allow me to look at and to view not just one context of requirements, but move from that user story view into the document view, and it will let me create links between that user story and those requirements. And I'll save that link. I'm building traceability just as I move between the tabs here of this particular form. And when I refresh this, I'll start to see the traceability view change. I'll start to see the work items that are added to traceability. And really, I can start figuring out how I'm going to choose to implement this. Maybe I'll decide at some point I'm going to estimate this in story points. So let's just say we're playing sprint poker. I'm going to estimate story points at 3. And now it's really time for me to involve this into a sprint. I'm going to put it in this iteration 4. And so if I want, I can just simply drag this over. Sorry, let me click it and drag, or just add it to the plan. And now I'm adding this particular user story into my iteration 4 with the number of story points at 3. and we'll go ahead and accept this into that iteration. So now maybe it would be appropriate for me to plan some tasks. So I'm going to plan for a task to say we're going to implement this. Maybe I'll add another task to not implement, but set up the test case. And maybe at this point, I'll estimate that I think this is going to take 2 hours to write that test case. And perhaps I'm going to think to assign it to myself. And in fact, I might even choose here to come up and assign this to myself as well. Now let's see how this has affected our overall sprint. So here's our sprint. We haven't really started it. I'm going to start it right away. And so now this sprint is in action, and I have 16 story points to implement. And one of the ones that you see is the user story that I just created. And maybe I want to be able to make sure that I can show progress on this. And in showing progress, Polarion asks me about who's doing the work. Well, David Merrill's doing the work, and I think this is going to take 2 hours as well to do. And I'll save that. All of the changes then that go into implementing this are tracked just as carefully as the requirements in question. Let's go back to our document, and then I'll wrap it up for our presentation for the day. In terms of viewing the traceability, I'll be able to take a look at the traceability tree. I'll be able to expand the same tree as we did before, and we'll look at 4 levels down. Now, if I'm really interested to see not just about requirements and test cases, but I want to see requirements and user stories, the full bandwidth of traceability is easily viewed in this particular dynamic view, where I can come up and have additional query information. Say, for example, I'm only interested in things assigned to me. Well, I don't have any particular software requirements assigned to me, but let's filter this out to all the linked items. And then again, still, I don't have any particular software requirements assigned to me, so I need to pick up a different version. Or I might choose to go back and then view this document into its original form and begin the process necessary to route this document for review and approval. Okay, let me pause for a moment. There's a couple of questions that have come in and some comments. The question is asked, can I view the traceability between items in an Excel-like view? I think we've trapped some of those just a little bit before. I will show that some reports, key traceability reports, might show up inside the specification space alone. For example, if I'm looking for, say, requirements to user story coverage. Here is an excellent presentation in the traceability of these, where I see the requirements tracing to user stories and to issues in this case, but it also could be to include tests. This is a way of being able to both test for coverage, things that are covered by downstream artifacts, or absent of that particular coverage. Similar, I might look at requirements that are or not covered by test cases. Okay, very good. I'm going to return to the slide deck to conclude this part of the demonstration. We're coming up to just about the end of the presentation, and I want to make sure that we have some time to address the direct questions and answers. So beyond the demonstration, we want to be able to manage all of the design inputs and outputs of what goes into product development. And if projects require a level of rigor in producing documentation, then Polarion allows you to create those documents. If that rigor is not required, then the workflow engine, the need for electronic signatures is relaxed a little bit. Polarion supports the full capability of electronic signatures to documents and work items that you can do within Polarion. You might be able to do today with paper documents and wet ink signatures. Beyond the demonstration is also the incorporation of risk management, whether it's a very minor inclusion of risk management or following a more formal, say, design FMEA approach to software development. And being able to eliminate Excel spreadsheets as the source of the data and simply use spreadsheets as a way to be able to collaborate outside of Polarion or as a reporting vehicle for outputs from Polarion. And then really be able to take and manage the verification and validation sequences associated to product development. So it takes the idea of the DOORS requirements and gives it the full citizenship necessary to be able to release that project. Okay, well, let me pause now. I'll stop the formal part of the presentation and go back to some questions. Okay, so one question is, it's always a good one. It generally shows up is what kinds of licensing are available for Polarion. There is quite an array, and I would say to really understand all the licensing methods, please contact us via the email that you'll see at the end, or contact your Siemens representative. There are perpetual licenses that you can own that allow you to use just requirements, just quality or QA modules, or the full ALM suite. There's also term licenses available so that rather than owning the license perpetually, you only subscribe to it for 1 year. The Polarion server can be hosted internally, or as I'm using it, in the Amazon Web Services cloud. And there's also SaaS options that are available through Siemens as well. So it is very comparable to a DOORS NG SaaS model, but it also matches up with what you might be using today for the institutional use of DOORS 9. And we sort of see a wide array of customers that opt for keeping this kind of intellectual property within the boundaries of their own network perimeter, or those that really are looking to extend beyond that perimeter and securely collaborate with stakeholders that are consultants, other customers, auditors, or industry reviewers, so that they can maximize the amount of collaboration or the distribution of work. To say nothing of being able to respond more favorably to a global company where internal use of a VPN might already be strapped. So making the advantages of a highly available web services cloud means that data can get to that stakeholder sometimes faster and easier if it's secured through SSL and SAML authentication, but in a hosted or virtual private cloud scenario. The bottom line is that Polarion isn't affected in its feature or functionality based on how you happen to implement it as a server. Okay, another question is asked: can you create custom scripts for automating certain tedious and repetitive tasks? Well, one of the important things that I brought out initially is that DOORS had a very powerful DXL scripting language. Polarion would not be a good augmentation or even a substitute for DOORS if it didn't have that same, if not really enhanced ability. And I will tell you that a lot of the things that go into customized use include a scripting language and a robust API from Polarion, which is publicly available to read and see how you can tie that custom scripting into small events like workflow events, or much larger operations like being able to ensure that a software release version is ready to release to manufacturing. The same type of operations that you key into quick movement in DevOps, from development to testing to deployment, can be modeled in the Polarion release process. As an example to that, if I come back to our DOORS Survival Kit webinar, we have an entire space dedicated to the idea of planning. And not just that, but also the idea of having release items. And so I'll be able to build those same release functions into the product structure that I might have for Polarion documents. And then question is asked, does Polarion support online work? And maybe I'll kind of answer both questions, online and offline. Everything that you've seen today has been online work. I've been directly logged into the Polarion server as a stakeholder. I've had license rights and I've had particular usability rights that give me access to what I need to have access to, but prevent me from accessing the information maybe that I shouldn't have access to. And so that might be tied into activities like creating work items individually, modifying documents, or moving on to testing. So if I chose to take a look at testing procedures, maybe one of the things that I want to be able to do is take a look at the results of tests, or maybe to dive right into test runs and be able to work on an active test run. So here's my online use of this test run, but now let me answer that second question that I posed in there. What about offline use? Well, if necessary, I can step in and export tests to Excel that I can pass off to someone offline. So being able to produce all of this information that we're looking at, whether documents or test runs or general reports, into an Excel format that customers and users can access directly, that can be taken offline. So there is no offline client to the Polarion interface. It's a very lean client and works nicely over sporadically connected and slow web communications, but it really is online. If I truly need to take it offline, then I can export the document as a Word document for management and change, or I can I could export a set of data out into Excel. So any view in Polarion, say if I wanted to go and simply query in Polarion, I want to query all of my system requirements, or I should just say all of my requirements, then I'll create a query for requirement. I have 53 of them. And then using this export tool, I can export all of these into Microsoft Excel. I can pick the fields that I want to be able to send out to the spreadsheet. And now that spreadsheet can be taken offline and worked on. And then once I make changes to the information that you see here, maybe it's as simple as changing the severity or altering the title or some of the custom fields. Then I can create new requirements, modify requirements, and submit that information back into Polarion without making manual changes. Very good. Okay, well, I think we've come to the end of our time today. I'd like to take a moment and thank you very much for your participation and offer to help you with a directed demonstration or a specific discovery into the challenges that you happen to face. In addition to demonstrations, the Corbinsoft team and our Siemens partner can work with you to set up a proof of concept or evaluation that will let you bring in some of these DOORS documents, these RecIF documents from your environment directly into a test scenario inside Polarion. So you won't have to take my word for it. You can start working with your specific information. And if what I said was true, if this really is a survival kit for your present use of DOORS, you should be able to do the same things that I did today in that evaluation context very quickly. And we at Corbinsoft are really here to help you out in that. So I encourage you to email me directly with any questions or future contact. I thank you very much for your participation. Again, we'll be publishing hopefully a better version of this webinar online. We'll edit out some of my hemming and hawing, but also make that available for you to show to your colleagues and come back and review as necessary. Thank you very much for your participation. Have an excellent day.